here with Bailey Caldwell. Bailey is the Director of Professional Services for RightScale. Welcome to Australia, Bailey. Thanks, Bailey. So give us the 60-second overview of RightScale.
Thanks for having me. So RightScale is a cloud management platform. We started when Amazon launched. We were actually the first web front end to AWS. And early on, our CTO and founder, Torsten Van Eycken, realized that cloud represented a new way to bring IT services to market. So since then, we've been busy working away on our platform and developing cloud services and cloud management capabilities across what is now known as hybrid cloud. So, when I first started at RightScale 5 years ago, there was Amazon and Rackspace. And actually, my first tour of duty in the company was building out our partner ecosystem. Over the next couple of years, we ended up working with 100 plus partners on the channel SI side, the ISV side, and the cloud side. So we've worked with clouds that don't exist anymore. FlexiScale, you ever hear of them?
No.
That's so long ago, very few people even know they exist. IDC Frontier, who got acquired out of Japan, used to have a cloud. So what we realized several years ago, and certainly we did have 10, and we have 8, is that there's different classes of cloud services. And the only one class that's really proven itself to be viable is the mega clouds, right? So you have companies like Amazon and Azure and Google that have enough critical mass to build a 100,000 square foot data center, not to service cloud, to service their core business, right? In Microsoft's case, they build a data center when there's enough Windows update agents in a country, right, to talk to the back end to download the update software. So those companies and the capital they can exert on this public cloud space problem there's only 3, and I don't think there's going to be 4th. And then there's the specialized clouds, as we define them, which would be a Rackspace with higher service levels, maybe an IBM software with some enterprise capabilities, bare metal. And I think that part of the market, which was theorized to be maybe there'll be a HIPAA cloud, for example. Maybe there'll be industry domain-specific clouds. It's still very unclear to us. So in reality, while we still support 8 clouds, I really think of it as 3. There's 3 mega clouds we support, and then there's the data center. And then the data center footprint is obviously dominated by VMware. We'll still see OpenStack. I think it's still a goal of many companies to try OpenStack. I think it's the economics of it are still really questionable in my mind. But I also wouldn't recommend buying full bore into either Microsoft Stack or VMware Stack as an alternative, because I think the economics of that have proven what that's not going to change in terms of how that plays out.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've done for a couple of clients recently is build private cloud stacks, where the history of Office is we had big shared VMware clusters of dozens and dozens and dozens of hosts, putting hundreds of clients' VMs into that in a mix where it could be half a dozen for this client, 50 for that client, anything in between. Whereas what we're starting to do now using the RightScale platform is identify this requirement for private cloud stacks where we can build that for the client, bind it to a RightScale agent, and rather than us have to control the provisioning into that shared environment, which you wouldn't do into a shared environment, we can give the client the right to and the permission and full control to provision what they want into that fixed set of resources in a private cloud stack, where we're doing the facilities management and maybe the operating system and VMware or OpenStack or whatever, but they're provisioning their environments and their workloads and controlling that side of things. So I think there's going to be an increasing uptake in that type of technology.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think it ties well to the concept of, in a lot of cases, for the enterprise customer, they have pre-existing investments, and if you can strip a CMP over the top of some of those assets, give them some new infrastructure, and tie them into public cloud, you've just extended the lifetime of their service capability dramatically. And they may never have to build another data center, or they might. It just depends on how that unfolds for their business.
I think that'll be about the growth in the requirements as they get more agile and more concurrent development activity going on. So you're aware of the environment provisioning automation project that we're doing with one of our large clients at the moment, where we're literally taking over 100 applications, a complex environment, and being able to, with the push of a button, provision that into either a private cloud or a public cloud. To what extent are we seeing that sort of use case in the market?
Yeah, so you've given me some details on this particular client, and I think what's interesting about it is the all-in nature of it. A lot of adoption cycles, as we talked about earlier, start with dev test, put your toe in the water, make sure it works, and then evolve from there into CI and CD. I think obviously they had to have done some toe in the water like experimentation to get to the point where they are, but clearly your team has done a great job bringing them very fast from, hey, we think there's an opportunity for us in this cloud world to improve our agility, right? I mean, that's ultimately what it's about, to saying it's actually so good that we're going to pretty much put the whole company and all our assets from a software and IT perspective into a cloud model. So I think that's, it's unique in the context of how you've actually done it. It's not unique in the context of people's desire. There are a lot of companies that will say, we're all in on cloud and we're cloud first across the board. Actually delivering on that once they get into the trenches becomes a much more difficult challenge. And it relates to what we were talking about earlier with regards to where is Australia in the adoption cycle of cloud. Many businesses out of the US that I've worked with directly have been all in on cloud for years, and they're still not there. And I think that's their appetite was larger than their ability to execute. It's also the reality that technology changes so quickly that whatever approach they might have picked 4 or 5 years ago, let's take Zynga for example, where they built their own private cloud, they pulled everything off Amazon. Well, now they're pushing everything back to Amazon because they don't want to recapitalize that asset in their private data center. So the life cycle of technology still exists, right, in a cloud world.
Yeah, I think that's actually a good point too. It's about protecting the capital expenditure of the past too, and continuing to get use out of it, which is one of the things I really like about the RightScale platform.
Yeah.
With the, in Australia, the majority of private clouds are utilising VMware. Mm-hmm. So we can put the RCAV onto that VMware cloud, bind it to the RightScale account, and give the client the benefit of being able to provision in an automated fashion into both public and private cloud. That's awesome capability that I think will be one of the big use cases in Australia as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, just to kind of take off of that point with regards to competitive landscape, I mean, if you're a CIO right now, it's a difficult circumstance. I mean, I would argue it's probably harder now than it ever has been because your ability to control the assets you're responsible for is completely different than it was 10 years ago. As a CIO, which you've been, you used to build a data center, and sure, you might have outsourced providers and contractors working on it, but ultimately, you owned the outcome of that solution. In a hybrid cloud ecosystem, your ownership and the way it gets delivered is vastly different than it used to be. You're going to be relying on not a handful of vendors, not a dozen of dozens of technologies, but hundreds of technologies in this ecosystem. And so you really have to challenge your own organizations and your thought process to move away from controlling every outcome to actually dealing with a massively heterogeneous environment that's just exploding. It's not going to get any simpler in the next 5 years. It's going to get more complex.
I completely agree. The complexity is rising, and that's probably a really good segue into a question around where I see one of the real strengths of RightScale is that is governance in a multi-cloud environment.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that's, years ago we were very focused on this thing called a server template and making a virtual machine a SQL server or a MySQL server. And I think, we forked an earlier version of Chef. We did a ton of work with Bash scripts and PowerShell and configuration management approaches. That's now an industry unto itself. You have Salt, Ansible, Chef, Puppet. I mean, back then it was Puppet and that was it. Chef was a brand new player on the block. So we've extracted our platform further away from having an opinion about how something becomes a SQL server. You can certainly use RightScale, you can use Ansible, Salt, Chef, whatever. We happen to use Chef, and much more into caring about the overall continuum and the governance factors that you described. So the way I like to think about RightScale and how we've started marketing is this concept of universal cloud management, from bare metal to containers and everything in between. Provisioning platform as a service, provisioning Rancher and Docker and clusters around containers as well as virtual machines is really the ecosystem you're operating within. And then you add to that self-service and plugins and all the other HTTP services out there that you may want to interact with. I think we've hit a good sweet spot in the market that we can build more and more capability on.
We're here today with Greg Steele. Greg is a senior consultant and solution architect with Offis Multicloud Services. Would you agree that the world is going multi-cloud?
The world's already gone multi-cloud. I think the world went multi-cloud well before people realised that they were multi-cloud. As soon as you signed up for your first Gmail account, you were multi-cloud. So in terms of organisations making deliberate decisions to go multi-cloud, that is a much more recent thing. And it's one of the things that organisations find it very difficult to make that decision, because it raises so many questions, automatic questions about if I make this cloud available and accessible and integrated to my organisation, how am I going to manage that? How am I going to make sure it works well for me? I'm going to make sure people get the service that they expect.
So what do you think are the key challenges with a corporate entity being multi-cloud with a deliberate strategy of multi-cloud?
May depend to extent on its size. So I've done a lot of work with big corporates, and the biggest challenge there is that anything you're going to do with cloud is going to involve having systems work with each other, having one server over here on one cloud work with a server that's in a private data center or a cloud over there. To make that sounds simple, but to make that happen, there are so many different people involved, so many different sub-organisations involved, all of which have their own rules and standards and processes. So to make that work, you actually need to get a lot of people on the same page, a lot of people pulling in the same direction. And most of the changes that they're making to the way they do that can be challenging for them, or can be changing their role to an extent that they're not comfortable. So the bigger the organisation, the harder that is to do. And I guess you see it happen through often subversive activities. Probably the way a lot of organisations end up seeing that either it's not so scary or it is manageable, or the value is just so huge to the business that you have to go down that path and you have to embrace cloud and multi-cloud. So going to multi-cloud, I think, is one of those things that would tend to happen probably either by accident or by there being some compelling business benefit from going multi-cloud. You may have built a whole bunch of stuff on AWS, but if you choose to use a software as a service platform that may be being stood up on a different cloud provider, on Azure, say you choose to use SharePoint on Azure, then you've become multi-cloud. And that happens simply because there's business benefit in doing so. The difficulty then is managing that multi-cloud state.